But I think I'll just give a very quick introduction, if I may, just to welcome everybody hugely to this meeting. This part one in our Don't Panic: How Brands Can Survive in Chaos or Thrive in Chaos. So this is two events which we're running for the Museum of Brands. And I'm delighted that Museum of Brands is on the call.
Well, let's see.
And so
it sounds like they might
those in the museum, please
from what Simon was saying.
So if I could ask anybody to go on mute would be great. Those in the museum, if you want to put your emails into the chat, so if anybody wants to contact you about the museum, they can do so. That would be fantastic. But otherwise, I'd just like to welcome our chairman and our panelists. So we have Adam as chairman, editor of The Grocer. Adam, thank you so much for your support for this. And on the panel, we've got Benedict Evans, we've got Alan Giles from Side Business School, Sarah Hepworth from Dr. Urker, and Nick Theodore from Virtual Store Trials. So a very warm welcome to you all and to everybody who's joined the call. Great to see you all. So Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be supporting a great cause in the Museum of Brands, of course, but the aim here is for brands to learn, and of course the Grocer plays I hope a crucial role in helping brands to learn to adapt to these changing lives and changing behavior. And that's the subject that we're talking about today. If I could have the first slide, please, caller. The good news for brands is that they have performed actually incredibly well in the pandemic. And you'll see here that the outperformance of Britain's biggest brands in our survey recently over own label for the first time since 2014. You can move on from that slide though. But actually no, don't keep on that one. Sorry, go back. But it's complicated. The situation is complicated, and we know that the world has changed forever, but we don't know how much of the new normal is permanently normal and how much is temporarily normal, and we don't even know what normal is. Let's face it. So. You know, I was thinking about this in the context of trains and buses. You know, they're empty right now, and if they are eventually half full, what does that actually mean? It's far bigger than what that means for National Rail or buses. It affects cities and it affects everything. So, you know, it's such a complicated and uncertain picture here. So I'm very grateful to have such a distinguished panel to discuss some of the ramifications of what's going on in terms of changing behavior and all that. And I wanted to start with my second slide by looking back at one of the key takeouts of the last year, which is the range reductions. And we have, it was a key factor, was that all the supermarkets simplified their supply chains. And there were lessons for brands as well as for supermarkets. And actually, this is some research that Nick Theodore has done at Virtual Store Trials, which showed some rather interesting and sobering findings for the market more generally. Nick, could you just talk us through that? What does it tell us?
Of course, yeah. Thanks, Adam. So we're Virtual Store Trials, so we test in front of thousands of shoppers when we're working with brands. And you know, for us over the last year, probably about half of the projects that we've conducted have been working in conjunction with retailers and with brands to help them understand what's going to happen over the, you know, if we make those changes today. So we put these virtual environments up in front of shoppers to say, what happens if we actually reduce that range in front of these shoppers by 20% or by 50%, or the most extreme one that we tested was actually removing 70% of the range. So for something like toilet cleaners, we don't actually need maybe 90 SKUs of toilet cleaners in a range. So, you know, we saw some really positive results from these, which really surprised us. One of those, you know, on average, we were kind of looking at about 20% reduction in SKUs. So that was mainly across the likes of Tesco and Asda over the last year. And we saw some really interesting average findings across these, which was resulting in a 7% sales increase. So what was most interesting to us there, real kind of commercial benefits to do so for shoppers actually picking up more items and trading up when they saw fewer items on there. But also, so importantly, in supermarkets over the last year, increasing or improving that shopping trip that actually speeds it up for shoppers making those decisions. So we're measuring what those shoppers are doing, and actually they were shopping, making a faster shopping trip by 5%. So obviously during COVID times, when actually getting people in and out of that store is really important, and the winners are very much the retailers who are doing that and improving that and making shoppers feel safe and secure doing that, we really saw that. And then a couple at the bottom, the kind of big points that we saw is that it isn't actually just about removing products in there either. It's actually about getting the shelf layout right as well. So you can do that with your current range, and it's not about having a blanket ban of saying, you know what, you need to reduce your range by 20% of SKUs. It's for some categories, it's more extreme than that. And for a lot of categories, it doesn't need it. Mm-hmm. And so for us, it's all about seeing that we're seeing the brands that really win are the ones that are taking that vision to the retailers, and, you know, simple category management, but backed up with data and insight to really back up those opinions on that.
I want to come back to that question of category captaincy in a second, but first of all, I'd like to bring in Sarah at this point and to talk about what the impact of all this is online, because Nick gives the in-store perspective here. But what happens when you reduce SKUs online?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, and I think it's one of those, like, this is as it says on the slide, an unpopular fact, because as a brand, when somebody says range rationalisation, you automatically panic and think it's the end of MPD and SKU cuts, etc. But actually, if you work it right, you do get the benefits in store, and where it especially performs well is online. So one of the biggest frustrations online is availability, out of stocks. Unfulfilled is a massive KPI for retailers online. It can mean it can make quite a big difference. It can make you switch retailers if you get in a high amount of substitution. So it's absolutely the number one thing. So actually having more space per SKU in store actually works really well. So we've seen some really great examples of this within a retailer where our unfulfilled has actually dropped because we've received an extra facing of a product. So it absolutely does work well from an online perspective, especially because, you know, we're still you know, in the area where most retailers, it is all picked from store. They have got a lot of work to do. So in terms of the time, the spend picking in store, so anything that's on a gondola end space as well, and gondola ends also come into rationalisation as well. So instead of having lots of SKUs on an end, if you have 2 or 3 on an end, that helps because online pickers have pick paths, so they go to the location. If there's no stock there, it will say on their system to check gondola end 4. So they've got that other location. So it's not just about shelf, it's also about gondola ends as well. But this is a huge win for online. And as online gets more and more a bigger percentage of sales, it's absolutely not something to be scared of.
It's interesting though, because it's a huge win for online, but it's not great news for MPD, is it? And you know, that how do you make sure that you can get the interest of retailers when they're going to say all you're doing is complicating things? We want the best sellers and nothing but best sellers.
I think it's being pragmatic enough to, you know, I think retailers react well to when you sort of openly target your own range first and address your own tail. But I think it's about differentiation and it's about need state. So if that MPD has a different need state for that customer, then that's great and you've got a solid argument. If it's just a me too of something else that's in there, then that's a problem. So I think it's really holding you know, yourselves to account that your MPD has got a point of difference and will attract a different shopper or a new occasion or whatever it is, and just making sure that you are absolutely held to account.
Yeah, okay. Let me turn to our third slide, which is a slide that we what is it? I hope it's the right one. Yeah, there it is. Look, this is a slide that talks about 2 key metrics you've got in red is the number of products. And you can see it's been very turbulent, to say the least. You had this massive drop off as basically ranges were simplified by the retailers. And then it's sort of significantly recovered, not perhaps to quite the same extent, but you went from 154,000 products across the 6 main online retailers down to sort of about 135,000. And as you say, as you can see, it's come up again. And then it dipped off towards the end of last year. The other figures, by the way, just to be clear, the blue figures are broken down, but they are promotions. And you saw obviously an understandable reduction in promotions. Wasn't a lot of point in promoting at certain points last year because everything was just selling off the shelves at whatever price. So I just wanted to talk about that, this whole thing, because, you know, 154,000 versus 130,000, even at its lowest point, it's not that big a move. And what we've not really seen is a huge move towards sort of category captaincy. I mean, certainly some retailers I know have asked for it at times, but it strikes me that supermarkets need trade marketing, and it's not just about sales. They actually need the commercial income as well. So how do you get that balance right, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's a real tricky one, because you know, I know a lot of brands, you know, they put their investment behind the new products and building new brands, and that's really difficult when it is, you know, your core that's selling. So it is a bit of a tricky balance, and I think there's a real struggle now with rate cards online versus in store. So online rate cards are, you know, really massively inflated as retailers are trying sort of more directed as to put more investment into store, and that's just to balance the profitability of online.
Yeah.
And actually try to get these new online shoppers that they've done so well to capture in 2020, to try and get them into store where it's more profitable. So I think there's definitely more emphasis on trade marketing from a store perspective. And I think from a supplier, it's getting the balance right of, we still need to invest in line because that's where the growth's coming from, and retailers need to make that profitable, but it's at a very high cost. So there's more of a move to trying to weave the two together. So you've got the trade marketing plan has an omni-channel approach, because if you look at it, in-store returns versus online returns, you'd never probably spend anything online. It's getting that balance. Hopefully that, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I've got a question from I think this is from Joel Smith. And by the way, I hope that you're all texting in your questions as we go along. I'm trying to monitor them via my mobile phone. One of the potential challenges for brands is getting innovation into store. What do brands need to do differently to maximize effectiveness? Any thoughts on that, Nick?
What do brands need to do differently to get in store?
Yeah.
So I do think there's a change in the way that retailers will be operating over the coming months, and I think we're starting to see this turn around a little bit as a result of the range rationalization pieces, which is, yes, there's going to be less NPD, there's going to be fewer new products on shelves, but I think we're not going to, or what I'm hoping is, and what we're hearing is that we're not going to see the same kind of previous lack of investment from a retailer side for NPD as well, which is quite frequently we've done a whole bunch of new product testing, and actually you might find yourself with one facing in the bottom left-hand corner of your range. And guess what? The new product's not going to succeed with that kind of visibility in there as well. Yeah. So I think there's a fair bit of fair challenging that can come from the brand side, which is, if I'm giving up some of these SKUs and there's an appetite for this new product, it's totally fair to be asking for that better space that comes alongside it. And again, you know, we see an improvement in space going from bottom shelf to eye line, increasing anywhere from 50% to 150% in share of spend, and all of those kind of good numbers in there as well. So what can they do differently? I think it's very much just about proving what you have first, and that is a really key point for them. And I expect as a result of this, hopefully we're going to see some of that kind of trial and error, the trying stuff and it not working reduce, and actually we're going to see those success rates really improving as a result of it over the coming months.
I think there are a lot of supermarkets out there, or one or two notable supermarkets, making a big play of innovation at the moment anyway. So I would have thought that that's something to respond to. I want to move on to our next slide, though, because really, in a way, the outlier, actually from a delistings point of view, is Asda. They've already cut a lot of SKUs, but if you look at that previous chart, most of the cuts were actually coming from Asda, and they're determined to keep going with that in terms of delistings. No one really knows how far they will go, but I wanted to bring in Alan to talk about this move towards EDLP from them, and of course from Tesco as well with its club card strategy. Alan, what does this all mean for them, for these players who are trying to be more EDLP and for the market?
Well, I think what I'd say, Adam, is just stepping back and thinking what's driving this change. I mean, there is a longer term structural problem for many retailers where they have too many stores, and specifically too many large stores. And I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that that is the problem for Asda. And the reason for that is that we're all seeing a shift of business to online. That is eroding the base of sales that can go through stores. And the problem with a store network is that largely that's fixed cost, whereas your online channel is largely variable cost. So you've got the sort of unpalatable situation that sales are coming out of a channel and increasing losses, and yet moving into a channel where it drives up costs to put through more volume. So I think we'll see more of this. Asda are clearly experimenting with trying to fill parts of their store space by bringing in arguably complementary retailers like AO.com, Accessorize, Decathlon. We're seeing that in Tesco and Sainsbury large stores too. So the direction of travel of this is clear, but I would make the point that I think the commercial leaders at those retailers will be very worried about losing range authority. So they won't want to go too far. I mean, as a veteran retailer myself, I've seen so many examples where consultants have come in and said, look, 80% of your sales are coming from 20% of the range. Therefore, you can get rid of a lot of that range. I think history shows us that that's often a fallacy. And my final comment, Adam, on EDLP is, again, if you look back over history, there is a cycle here. So EDLP is tantalizing because it simplifies the business for the retailer. It arguably simplifies decision-making for consumers. But the problem is it gets boring. So whenever anyone goes off onto EDLP, eventually they bring back in promotions to try to add excitement.
Yeah, completely. What about, of course, underscoring this is price matching against the discounters. What about this from an online point of view, the pitfalls of EDLP, Sarah, in an online environment? Are they the same or are they different?
It's different. So EDLP is a real challenge online because most retailers' algorithms will favour promotions, so you do have better standout when you're on promotion, and also you're more likely to as a brand invest behind a promotional message when you are on a half price or a meal deal or whatever that might be. You're more likely to put your investment against that to really drive. So we have seen our share gap widen between store and online as EDLP has been implemented. So it's a real challenge, and I don't have an exact answer to give you on how you overcome it, because my only advice would be when you can't rely on promotions to really give you that algorithm boost, it's making sure everything else is absolutely perfect. So discoverability across all the top search terms for that product, making sure, you know, whatever search terms you are targeting are in your title, your images are best in class. So it's getting all the organic basics better to make you stand out, because it is really, really hard to have any kind of presence when you're at an EDLP online. So it is sort of one of the biggest challenges in terms of that standout. And like I say, what do you really spend your money on from an investment perspective? If it's EDLP all year round, that makes it a lot harder to get that investment behind a big deal like you would have done in the past.
Yeah. Let me move on though to one of the other biggest stories in the next share, and to introduce Benedict, who has been an analyst observing the huge changes over 20 years. And you've called this, Benedict, sort of 5 years of growth in one. Can you talk a bit more about how you see the market now?
How long have we got? So several observations. The first of them is, like, when you look at kind of technology growth, you know, the classic thing you expect to see is this sort of amazing hockey stick where, like, everybody goes, oh my God, this is amazing, this blows our mind, this is changing everything right now. And e-commerce is actually kind of the opposite. It's more kind of like a boiling the frog moment, in that this stuff has been growing a couple of points a year for 20 years. And I mean, as you can see, up until the beginning of 2020, you know, a little bit more every year, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And it slowly gets to the point that this goes from being interesting to exciting to a problem to kind of, oh, hang on, what do we do about this? Which is kind of what happened to newspapers sort of 15 years ago as well. And we're now, I think, the pandemic, on the one hand, crystallized a realization of how big this was, and on the other hand, crystallized for kind of consumers, was a sort of a moment of sort of forced experiment and forced adoption, where everyone sort of realized that they could buy anything online and had to try and buy everything online. And so we had this sort of step change in penetration. Online grocery doubled from a pretty low base, from sort of 5% to 10%. I think the most striking thing is if you exclude grocery. And I think the interesting thing about that, the split between grocery and non-grocery, which I'm sort of showing on this slide, is to think about logistics models. So for sort of 20 years, we kind of talked in terms of different kind of product segments, like shoes versus makeup versus toys versus books, and different ones would go online in different ways. I think it's equally useful to say, well, what can be a parcel and what can't? And so what this chart is showing you is stuff that could be a parcel is now 40 to 50% online. Stuff that can't be a parcel, which basically means grocery. I mean, you can put furniture and a few other things in there, but basically stuff that can't be a parcel is sort of now 10% online. And then you also have restaurants, which are something like a third collection or delivery before the internet. When you take in kind of takeaway and take out and fast food. So you've got these kind of splits between parcel retail, truck retail, and bike retail, if you like. And what sort of happened is that parcel retail is now 50% online. Truck retail is sort of 10% online. And bike retail, there's an explosion of kind of capital pouring into trying to change how that would work. So I think that's sort of one way of thinking about it, which is the logistics split. I think the other way to think about it is what's the buying journey, and which of course comes to the brand question. So, you know, when we went from corner shops and convenience shops to giant supermarkets, we didn't just sell all the same stuff, but have more stock of the same SKUs. You know, the number of SKUs exploded, the brands all changed, everything changed about what you sold and how you sold it, and, you know, what the whole kind of value chain looked like and who paid who for what. And I think in kind of every retail category, the same thing is now happening again as you go online. It's a bit like, you know, what did cars do to retail? That sort of kind of question is, well, what does the internet do to retail? And so now, you know, sort of looking at sort of spend some of my time in venture capital looking at startups. On the one hand, there's an explosion of people asking, well, what would different logistics models be? Where, you know, in London, very obviously, you can see the sort of the 1 hour grocery delivery model. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, what's the buying journey? What's the customer experience? How do you decide what you would want to buy? How do you move from going to Amazon, knowing exactly what you want and typing in the right query and hitting the thing, to like, kind of like a new shirt? Because that's not a good Google query, and it's certainly not a good Amazon query. And so like the whole other side is there's a logistics side, and then there's kind of the recommendation discovery kind of buying journey side. And of course that changes what brands get bought, changes what brands matter, changes how they matter. And I think the one other thing, and then I'll sort of stop talking, is that, there's a sort of, the naive view kind of 3 or 4 years ago was, well, if we sell online, then we'll save all of this money on rent. And of course, what happens is that half of your money goes on, the treadmill of faster and faster delivery and on returns, and a third of your sales might be returns. And the other half goes on, well, if you're not using rent to tell your customer that your product exists, how are you telling your customer that the product exists? Because in effect, rent is part of marketing in that sense. It's half marketing and half logistics. And so what you saw was a whole bunch of companies that didn't have a physical store spent all their money on logistics and marketing and then started opening stores. So there was this joke, rent is the new customer acquisition cost. Mm-hmm. So there's this sort of fundamental kind of reconfiguration of, well, how does the customer find out about it? And how do you get it to the customer? And how does that change what the buying journey looks like, what the brands look like, who owns the brands, what the aggregation model is? Should you go direct? Should you give up and you're never going to be able to go direct? You want a customer relationship. Can you build a customer relationship? Are you actually that kind of company at all? And all the questions that come out of that.
Yeah. Let me flick on a slide or two, if I may, just quickly. So this, can I just, no, one more. Yeah, there we go. So this was, I was trying to get this slide up for the audience to see this. This is what you were talking about here, weren't you, Benedict, in terms of the reconfiguration. But then if I go on one further slide, this is about Shopify. I just wanted you to talk about Shopify, because everyone talks about Amazon, understandably. But Shopify, what's the significance of Shopify in all this?
So 3 or 4 different things. So one of them is, so in case anyone doesn't know, GMV is gross marketplace value. Shopify provides tools to make it easy for you to build an online store. It's not really a consumer-facing brand. It's a software platform. And last year, their GMV doubled to about $120 billion. That's about 40% of the value of Amazon Marketplace. Amazon doesn't disclose it directly, but they tell you enough that you know what it is. So this thing's 40% of the size of Amazon from nothing 5 years ago. And there's sort of 3 things that come out of that. One of them is how wrong it is to say you can't compete with Amazon. Well, you can, but not at doing Amazon. You have to do something kind of slightly different, or come at it in a different way. Secondly, sort of any engineer would have looked at Shopify 5 years ago and said, well, this is stupid. Like, there's 50 things doing this. This problem was solved in 2000. It was solved in 1998 or so. This is a waste of time. But when you make it an order of magnitude easier, you address a lot more people. And the third is, who is it that's using it and why? Well, it shows you consumers ready to go online and ready to go direct to a brand rather than going through Amazon or through Google. And the other is it shows brands ready to go direct as well. And the interesting thing is, like, if you looked at Shopify, you might sort of imagine that it's all SMEs and sole traders and, kind of creator economy and all that stuff. And sort of half of it is, but the other half is Heinz and giant companies. And I think part of what's interesting about Shopify, that is like, you're a big retailer, you've got your SAP installation, you're perfectly happy with it, you can't ship less than 1,000 SKUs per order. And now you've got a problem. You want to do click and collect, but your point of sale system can't do click and collect. And this gets you to the whole sort of digital transformation conversation. But part of it also is you can plug Shopify onto your existing 20-year-old crappy e-commerce stack that you're deeply unhappy with. And so there's this sort of old narrative in tech that it used to be until that, the intelligence agencies got the cool technology first, and sort of 10 years later, the military got it. 10 years after that, big government got it. And eventually, sort of 30 years later, consumers would get it. And so, like, the CIA had all the cool secret stuff, or the Air Force had all the cool secret stuff. And now it's exactly the other way around. because the economies of scale of consumer electronics moved such that consumers get all the cool stuff first, and the military gets it like 25 years later, and giant companies get it sort of 20 years later. And so part of the narrative of e-commerce has been like, if you're a big, hugely well-resourced company, your e-commerce experience is terrible, and you find it incredibly hard to make it good because it's all built on kind of 20-year-old technology. And so part of the story of Shopify is sort of unbundling all of those components so that the giant company gets to use the same tech as a startup. And so that is a kind of an interesting kind of reconfiguration of how online buying goes. Yeah, I'll talk about this. For another hour, but that's one answer to the question.
Yeah. Let me bring in Sarah just to talk about when we tie this back into sort of brands versus own label and the role, with all these online shopping experiences, the role of data and algorithms, because obviously own label has the keys to the castle, doesn't it, really? How does one, as a brand, adapt with all this cool stuff, as Benedict was talking about, when one doesn't actually own the data?
Yeah, I think the algorithms question is an interesting one, because we do know that most of the, if we're talking major mults, such as the Asda's, Tesco's of the world, we do know that the majority of algorithms favour volume over value. So, own label does take precedent over brands from an algorithm perspective. So that is a challenge versus an in-store environment that, like I say, it tends to be the own label lines that are coming up first. I think there's various levers that you can look at, and it's about making those contacts within the retailers. I think there's a massive drive for online to be profitable. So retailers are really driving that profitability. So if you can, and that does sit well within brands. So if you can work with them on a plan. So we've just been working with one retailer where we've shared our full year promotional plan, and we've kind of highlighted, which of those promotions are category enhancing from a profitability perspective, to try and line up featured product space, and all that kind of stuff, which is in their gift. So that's one thing we've done. Also, and it kind of goes back to the NPD question. If you've got NPD launching, as a brand, you normally put in some kind of money behind it. So making sure that it's not just the buying team that are aware of that, it's the online team as well, pushing that, because actually giving your brand, your SKU a bit of a push is within their gift to do, more than we think. But they need to obviously know all the full picture to be able to make those decisions. So the more you can align to those KPIs, if you've got products that aren't as profitable for them, they're never going to push up the algorithm, because they're under such pressure on the profitability piece now. But if you can work with them on areas that are, you can absolutely challenge that, and challenge that brands can get further up, and all the benefits of doing that, increased basket spend. So I'd focus on those kind of conversations with the retailers. Okay,
let me ask you to go flip forward further, please, with Wise. Next one after that. So I just wanted to ask Alan to talk about this this question of where shoppers who shoppers are turning to. And Benedict was talking about Amazon and about Shopify in all this. It's very clear that right at the very top is Amazon, 63%, followed by search engines, i.e. Google, and retailer sites are distant, 33%, but they are at least ahead of other marketplaces. So they clearly have some power and some draw in all this. I just wanted to think about, though, the next slide on, Alan, the weaknesses of Amazon, because I think people are have been surprised that Amazon doesn't seem to have cracked the grocery market. And it's not the only problem it has, is it?
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, if you were sitting where Jeff Bezos is sitting, he would be looking at the very high levels of share that he's captured in developed markets across many non-food categories. But grocery would stand out as a big part of his potential addressable market, which he has failed to get a meaningful piece of. And, you know, $13 billion was spent on Whole Foods. They may yet make a success of that, but I don't think at the moment that there's evidence that they've had a good return on that investment. Clearly, they're now looking at how do they leverage their technology to try to grab a piece of the food market. You know, we've all seen Amazon Fresh, called Amazon Go in the US. I think that's very interesting from a point of view of trying to join up the dots on data capture. It's something that other retailers have really failed to do. They've got very good data quality about customer behavior online. They've been less successful in matching that up with in-store behavior. But I think what this particular slide shows, Adam, is that I think Amazon's Achilles heel is the flip side of its brilliant efficiency, speed of delivery, is that it is a classically soulless experience. You know, you don't go online with Amazon to discover things. It's very poor at discovery. It tends to perform much less well on fashion-led categories. I mean, again, if you look within apparel, it's good on the basics, but none of us would want to go to Amazon to buy something that we wanted to make a statement about ourselves. So I think if I was a retailer or a brand that was looking at how do I compete with Amazon, I would have some of the points on this chart in my mind as a way forward on that.
There's an interesting question here from someone asking about small brands, and the big legacy brands have done really well in the environment of online. But credit to Amazon, one area where they really do seem to have made some good ground is in helping small startup brands to get online, those that aren't in a position to use you know, the Hut Group or whatever. They seem to have really, that's been a differentiation for them.
I agree, and also Shopify. So Benedict made the point that Shopify is a route to market for Heinz and other big brands, but you only pay $29 a month to go on to Shopify to start accessing market. And indeed, a lot of venture capital in the US is now going in to try to pick up brands that have grown through the Shopify platform, through Amazon Marketplace, and try and build the next rival to Unilever or Procter & Gamble by aggregating up those relatively new small brands. And Adam, as a former competition regulator, I'm actually thrilled to see the barriers to entry coming down in that way.
It's a good point. I have to say, I haven't seen Shopify. I've seen Shopify do stuff with the Heinz or Heinz with Shopify, but I haven't seen it with the smaller brands in the same way, in the startups. It's
yeah, I mean, just coming back to that point, I mean, I think it's really kind of useful to think about what Amazon is trying to do, as opposed to how much from Amazon's perspective, as opposed to your perspective. And so there's this sort of old cliche that e-commerce has infinite shelf space. And I think for Amazon, it would be more accurate to say it has one shelf that's infinitely long. And so everything that it sells has to fit into exactly the same logistics process and exactly the same buying journey, because that's how they can kind of infinitely replicate to more products, more categories, more consumers, and so on. They just keep adding stuff. As soon as they were to start trying to make a different buying journey or a different logistics model, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And so I think that's why, you know, it's important not to see grocery as like one of the categories Amazon's doing and somehow they haven't worked there. Instead, grocery is just like an entirely different business. It's like saying, why haven't they done well in restaurants? Well, because it's just not at all the same business. It's a completely different logistics chain. And I think that also gets you to this sort of the kind of the buying journey question that, you know, a lot of the story of Amazon and indeed e-commerce for the last 20 years is, on the one hand, people saying, is this sort of question of is can you convert that to an online and a commodity buying journey? And sort of half of categories that people said, well, people won't buy that online. It turned out you will buy it online just because it's more convenient, or because you do free returns, or because it's cheaper, or there's more selection or something. And the other half has been, actually, no, you need to do something else that isn't that commodity journey. And so it turned out that people will buy shoes online. And they'll buy high fashion online, but they won't buy high fashion online from Amazon because you need a different experience and you need a different returns model and so on. And so that's why I kind of think, looking at, as I sort of said, like kind of talking about this stuff as e-commerce is slightly misleading. You kind of have to think about, on the one hand, this sort of spectrum of experiences, and on the other hand, this sort of question, well, what's the logistics model? Because, you know, it's trivial for Amazon to add makeup to its logistics chain. And, you know, it's absolutely undifferentiated from books or cookies or children's shoes. From Amazon's perspective, they're all just SKUs on a shelf. But it's orders of magnitude more difficult for them to add cucumbers than it is for them to add makeup, because it's a different logistics chain.
Yeah, yeah.
I agree with that, Benedict. The only observation I would make, though, is what I think is scary about Amazon, if you're in any way a competitor, is its proportion of revenues that it reinvests in research and development. So it is a double-digit percentage of revenues, not of profits, that it invests in R&D. And that's why it's got the deepest possible pockets to perfect technology such as Amazon Go, to keep reinvesting in Amazon Prime, which of course is an enormous sticky way of retaining customers. You know, they're not speculating about spending $9 billion on MGM Studios for the sake of it to make a return on that investment direct. It's all part of the ecosystem that keeps you as part of Amazon Prime.
I wanted to just make life rather complicated for the production crew behind this and skip back a few slides, if I may, because the conversation has gone in a slightly different direction. I wanted to come back to this question of the permanency of online. I mean, Benedict was talking about 5 years of growth. The question then is, what happens to it with that hockey? What happens after the hockey stick, if you like? So if you go straight one after that, we're talking here, this is a slide, I think, from McKinsey, which talks about some of the major changes that have happened. And this question of the permanency of online. Alan, there are lots of people who, there was a column by Mark Ritson the other day who was talking about those who say it's changed permanently have a self-interest in saying it's changed permanently. What do you see in terms of the likelihood of a continued growth, if you like, even at a slower pace, versus a stabilization at a new level, or a slight dip, or what, specifically for grocery?
So look, I think there was a clear systematic trend prior to COVID that most categories were seeing growth in the online component. COVID has been a sort of enormous shock, which has accelerated that trend. I think we will see some reversion back to the mean. We will see consumer behavior going back somewhat towards where it was, but it will, I think, continue that growth trend at a higher level. So my own, well, not my own view, but if I use Asiental's forecast, they're forecasting in the UK that by 2025, grocery about 11 to 12% will be online. Of course, if I look back at the first quarter of this year, it had already reached 11%. I think the implication is it will drop back to, I don't know, 7 or 8, and then grow up to 12 again.
It's actually been at 15 at the beginning of this year. Nick, if I could go to the next slide, Nick, you've done some research of shoppers, haven't you?
Yeah, we kind of took the opportunity with the tests that we've been doing with the kind of 25 to 30,000 people over the last 6 months or so to ask them, you know, are you shopping online? What's your plans at the moment, and how's that changing, and tracking that over time as well. And we saw some really interesting findings on this. And, you know, it was really interesting hearing Benedict's point there about, you know, Amazon, you know, can you do stuff and deliver stuff in certain ways when it doesn't come in a parcel, for example. I also think that flips over on the other side to shoppers, which is, does a shopper buy a banana in the same way that they buy a CD or a book? Probably not. And, you know, we see this kind of 50% of people at the moment, over 50% of people are saying that they are going to reduce or stop the purchasing of online grocery over the coming year. And obviously this is totally COVID dependent, and who knows what's going to change over the coming months as well. But it's really interesting to see that. And, you know, when we drill down into that, we see it's very much an experience problem, exactly as Alan was talking about, which is, does a shopper want to purchase things by seeing little thumbnails on a screen? And is that quite a jarring experience for people? And actually, is that just part of that really long trend of change that we're seeing, which is some people are kind of training themselves to buy grocery in that way? Or actually, do we need to do a better job on that front end kind of user experience of online grocery, so that when you go onto Tesco.com, for example, do you walk into a store, do you actually see a virtual depiction of those shelves, which of course can be personalized, it can be easier to use, you can have your favorites in front of you in a way that is a lot more real and a lot less jarring to get more people consistently and permanently shopping online and meeting their needs.
I guess the point here is that there's the difference. Benedict was talking about the lack of experience of the shopping experience, if you like, for Amazon. But the question is, for the grocers, is their experience any better, or is it simply because they have the Coles supply chain at the back end of it? Are you saying? I think what you're saying is that actually the grocers also need to do a better job with the experience. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. And is that going to see that mass adoption grow further?
And therefore, sorry, I have to make the obvious leap. And therefore, what role therefore can brands play in making that experience better?
I think there's a lot that the retailers need to do infrastructure-wise first, which is, there's a case of improving that. I think brands, we're going to see a huge rise in the world of category management for e-commerce versus in-store over the next few months. And if I was, in a team investing at the moment in a brand, that's where I'd be wanting to put a lot of my time and resource, which is actually more people that can help understand how shoppers are shopping online, what that's going to look like, because I think retailers are really going to open their doors more to that, receiving that advice, when previously it's been very separate in separate buildings, literally for most of the major malls as well.
Yeah, I do definitely agree with that. I think we've seen some of the grocers really up the game in terms of expanding their online team and openly wanting more engagement from suppliers now. And I think the category management piece is really interesting, because I think sort of in the past, a category manager's job has come up with, a range depending on the store plans, and it's just so much more complex now with online. So, like this stat here about Sainsbury's, where 17% of sales. Well, we had one retailer share with us just the other week how they've got 10 stores that over 50% of those sales from that store are online. So it really makes a huge difference store by store. So it's really getting into the need to get into such a granular sort of view of that data. So it's almost like store by store is where we're going, because it depends on the store location, how the online area it serves versus the shoppers going in differs hugely within that. So don't just look at that sort of number and think, right, 17%, because it's 1% in some areas and over 50% in others, and that it's a whole lot of complexity that we really need to get into the detail of to understand.
There was a comment, I spoke to David Potts the other day, and he described opening a store these days as a Trojan horse for online. I mean, what a reversal is that? So, the whole question of online profitability has changed from the narrative, I think, has to change from online can't make money, it doesn't make money, loses money, washes its face, whatever, to one where if a store is 50% online, then the economic model changes. And to me, it's significant that the likes of Sainsbury's and Asda have dropped their dark stores because the scale of and the volume they're pushing through their supermarkets is actually making them economically viable for the first time. So obviously, if it drops off again to the levels that Alan was talking about, then that's a problem. But if it carries on at anything close to the current rate, then it's a really a viable model. Once again, the supermarket, if you like, as a sort of distribution center.
There's an interesting split here. I was talking to a big US retailer yesterday that on the one hand, they're putting a lot of thought into how they make their physical stores endpoints for delivery, as opposed to endpoints to a truck-based logistics system. So instead of the customer going there, how do you integrate that into e-commerce? On the other hand, how do you make the store less of a story about logistics for the customer and more about experience and service and curation and differentiation? So on the one hand, like you're going from your store being a place where the truck unloads and the consumer goes and gets it. On the other hand, you're making it more of that, kind of both kind of in parallel.
Yeah, you don't want if it's a warehouse or if it's a micro fulfillment center, you don't want it to feel like a micro fulfillment center, because those in-store shoppers are still hugely important, aren't they?
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just, we've got limited time, and I just wanted to skip on a few slides because I wanted to talk about the other big story, and I think really it's actually emerged not just in 2020 but 2021, in fact, which is I'm going to have to skip through some of this stuff, so keep going. I wanted to talk about ODDs, or OFOs as some people call them, because this to me is a fascinating area, and you've got sort of, it's almost an area in which Amazon, which is the master of swift delivery, is almost not playing. Of course they are through Deliveroo, but and their stake in Deliveroo, but it's a market where you have these giant players, other giant players, the Sainsbury's, Ocado, and so forth, against these new dark store model small players like Getir with massive valuations, and Gorillas and all sorts of other ones, ASAP, there's one called, I mean, there's about 7 or so, and they've had huge valuations, they're growing fast. And the question is really, how should the market respond to this? Are these players you should be approaching? What are your thoughts, Sarah?
Yeah, I'd be getting in there now. I think I think these platforms are great. It's a different shopper. It's very different. So the shopper that Asda would get from their Uber Eats connection is a very, very different shopper to Asda online. So Waitrose at a conference the other week expressed that they were partnered with Deliveroo purely to bring in new shoppers to their brand as such. So it is a very different shopper. It's a very different mission. So consider that when you're actually recommending range. There will be pushback because again, there's obviously high fees from these players. So they're unlikely to list your lines that aren't as profitable for them. So it comes back to that profitability piece again. But there's so much flex within these platforms. They can change the menu sort of monthly, most of them. So there's definitely flex to, if you're a brand that has products that are quite seasonal, or different promotions on at different times, or MPD, these are great sort of levers to use. And I think it's interesting. I think some kind of retailers, I kind of think they're viewing it as a sort of stepping stone to have their own setup to be able to do this. So I think definitely watch this space from some who you've already seen it, Sainsbury's, Chop Chop, and even some of the convenience players are talking about using this as a temporary measure to get their own in place. But I think this same day delivery is definitely a trend that's here to stay. It is small at the minute, but it is growing at a fast rate. And like I say, the benefit of it versus the standard full shop on an Asda.com is bringing in a different shopper currently. So I think speak to your contacts, choose and recommend your range well, making sure it's the profitable SKUs that you're pushing forward, and take the advantage of that flexibility that these players have got.
And do you tailor it retailer by retailer as well, or do you just approach them the same way? Because you got the likes of Getir and Gorillas and all that lot, and then you got the Sainsbury's and these other people who are partnering with the distribution, the ODOs or whatever OFOs or whatever you call them.
Yeah, and that's the area where we sort of play in, is in the sort of retailer partnership side of things. But it's definitely worth brands getting their own relationships with contacts within these ODDs as well, because there's lots of other stuff that's coming down the path, such as virtual brand stores on these platforms, so less reliant on those retailer partnerships. For you to do something yourself, which would be a really good call for those smaller brands as well. So I'd definitely look to get your own relationships. But at this stage, we're finding it's very much retailer driven, what they want to put onto these platforms, rather than what we want on there. So we're trying to, I think we've got a job to do in terms of influencing that. But yeah, it's definitely worth forging your own relationships with these players as well, because there's definitely more to come, more options for brands on this platform than just via a retailer.
Okay, I realise that we've spent quite a long time on both these two big topics. That easily each of them could be an hour. We spent about half an hour, just under, on each. There's lots of other questions out there in the market, and lots of other things that I had in terms of slides to potentially talk about with you all. For example, stuff about the advertising market, and seeing the sheer number of ads on TV for food and drink right now is testament to that, but also the change of the mix towards the internet. We could talk about shop attainment, the growth of that in places like America and China. There's so much else going on. But the final thing, if I have the time, and John, you'll have to put me right, there's only one. I mean, there was somebody has asked a question about the concerns over government restrictions relating to high fat, salt, sugar. I think again that's a topic that feels like we could just spend half an hour on that alone. And then the other one though is sustainability. That's a huge story right now. But I kind of want to just end with a sort of provocative endpoint, which is a slide from Nick. If you keep going, this one. No, one back. That one there. Yeah, because everyone's talking about net zero, aren't they? And what we hear in the market is retailers and brand owners saying that sustainability matters hugely to shoppers. We know that there's all sorts of purpose-driven brands out there who are doing tremendously well. This is a real outlier, this research. And I just wanted Nick to try and make sense of it, because it's so sort of counterintuitive to what we're hearing in terms of success stories, in terms of retailer and brand priorities. What should brands do with that, Nick?
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I want to be really careful with this. I'm not saying that sustainability doesn't matter, which of course it absolutely does. And going and looking at the annual reports of every single major FMCG business, absolutely the right thing to be doing to focus on sustainability. And I think it's really important for consumers to see that. And it's very much a hygiene factor for people picking a brand, but it is less on the important side for shoppers. And so by that, I mean people actually in a store, actually browsing a website, which is when you are stood in front of the pet food category, for example, you are not thinking, right, I need to find the most sustainable option here. In fact, the people who were willing to switch products across many different categories that we've done these tests on is under 4% who would switch brands for sustainability reasons. But actually, the vast majority of shoppers claim number one reason is always about price. It's about value. It's then around promotions. It's about switching for your favorite brand, the favorite taste. And what I mean by this is really clearly that it's not about saying I've done something good and replacing plastic with card and recycled card and all of that, and then shouting about it all over your packs. It's about making it really, same old thing, which is making sure on your packaging, it's really valuable space. You don't have to tell your shoppers in particular that you've done a good thing with sustainability. You need to focus that on the price, the value claims, the effectiveness, flavor, brand, whatever it might be, that totally still take precedent on it. So sustainability, right thing to be doing. But focusing on the stuff that's important for shoppers on those packs is the real important one.
So sustainability is a hygiene factor, but a very expensive one.
It is. And, you know, that is where I think we see the real long-term value for consumers and brand building, which is something that develops over many years. Whereas for a shopper, in what we call that last meter of truth, where they are staring at a series of products on the shelves, that is less important to that person when you've got a screaming child in your arms and you're panicking because you can't find the only dog food that your dog will eat, for example.
Yeah.
Adam, if I could just add to that, I mean, I'm not remotely surprised by this finding, because I think if I look at something like the fashion industry has seen this, that if you talk to consumers, particularly young consumers, they are desperately concerned about supply chains, they're concerned about sustainability, the impact on climate change, but above all, they want great fashion at low prices. So I think it's about striking a balance between meeting consumers' needs, of which sustainability is a part, but it is only a part.
Yeah, it's a really good point that someone's made to this. There's been other research highlighting the intention gap between what people say and what at shelf or online might actually do. So I think the point they're making is that there's a role that brands and retailers need to play in bridging the gap. Yeah, through engagement, education, and obviously then there's government regulation as well. But anyway, listen, look, I believe I'm right in saying that we have to sort of call this to a halt now, John. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. As I said before, I thought that we could have just done an hour on one of these topics. We've really drilled into two of them in particular. I think they're really, really fundamental to what's happening in the marketplace. That question of ranges and strategy, pricing strategies, and then the question of online purchase behavior. I think these are two seismic changes that are happening in the market right now. And I think that the insight that the panel has brought to this market has been brilliant. So thank you very much indeed to all the panelists for this fascinating conversation. And I hope everyone found it useful. And thank you very much.
Great, Adam, and a big thank you to you too. It's been an excellent panel. Great thank you to the panelists. Just as in the final closing minutes, just a quick reminder that our part 2 of this event is taking place on the 23rd of June, chaired by Rita Clifton, who's Deputy Chair of the John Lewis Partnership, and we've got MediaCom, Mars Wrigley, BVA Nudge Unit, and the collective of that. Again, all proceeds in aid of the Museum of Brands. Great to see you all. Thank you so much. I'll let you know when the recording is available. Thanks a lot.